Hi, my name is Jayreid. I'm a psychotherapist in San Francisco, California. And today I'd like to talk about the coping strategy of making life difficult in order to survive narcissistic abuse. So this survival strategy is, I think, usually unconscious during the throes of having to survive narcissistic. But the thrust of it is that one works to kind of make one's own life feel more difficult than it actually may have to be for the person. And I don't mean that one claims to be suffering more than they actually are, but rather that the strategy is to make your own inner experience feel like a puzzle that can't be solved as a way to cope with chronic and often seemingly unending narcissistic abuse. And this is a strategy I've at least witnessed that can often develop in childhood, where the sense of all exits being blocked can be very, very strong for the child in a number of ways. So I'd like to kind of just illustrate this idea with a kind of in-depth, again, hypothetical case illustration that I think draws out this theme. And then after talking about this hypothetical client who's named Carol, and then I'd like to offer ways to kind of identify if this strategy has been in play for you, and then some other tactics to work to interrupt it and challenge it so that, in essence, the prospect of life and your endeavors in it feeling easy to you gets to be entertained and considered and maybe eventually lived from. So here's the case illustration. Again, all hypothetical is something I've sort of conjured up just to illustrate this point, but it will be reported as if this was an actual person and so forth. So Carol was a very smart and gifted client who came to therapy complaining of being unable to write a book, which she was hoping to write. She was a writer at her corporate job and had always been told that she wrote very well in high school and college. And in therapy, we discussed how she had grown up with a narcissistic mother who seemed to be mercilessly targeting of her for these, I put in quotes, supposed shortcomings, which Carol saw her mother as being convinced Carol had. And as a very, I think, conscientious person, Carol felt pained if others found her to be thoughtless or inconsiderate. And so her mother seemed to distort Carol's actions into evidence of Carol's thoughtlessness or inconsiderateness and or selfishness. And this deeply hurt Carol, given how important it was to her to attend to the feelings of the people she was close to. And so as we worked in therapy, as far back as Carol could remember, she had a difficult time envisioning and looking forward to a positive version of a future for herself. And yet, as an adult, she had found and built a career for herself as a technical writer in her job and had nurtured this long-held ambition to write a novel on the side. And in therapy, we discuss how frozen she would feel when she'd sit down to write her novel. She described this agonizing process of feeling as if she could not concentrate in the way she wanted in sitting down to write, but that somehow a burst of sort of concentration would occur, but it'd feel like it was as if some spell had come over her, as though she was possessed kind of in a good way, but she didn't know how she would get there, nor how to replicate it. So it would seem like this elusive state that she sort of had to cross her fingers that she could land in order to pursue this ambition of hers, get into the mode where she could produce the pages that she very much wanted. And as we explored her experience further, we also came to understand that one of the features of these sort of like mysterious bursts of concentration was that they often came with a holding of her breath. And as a result, her sense for her own ability to sustain this state of concentration felt deeply compromised, because you can't hold your breath forever. And she'd even find it that when she would release her breath, it would be harder to concentrate, that in a state of ongoing, inhale and exhale, it felt harder to her to concentrate in the way that she knew and felt necessary. On top of that, she noticed actually feeling endangered when she would try to both breathe regularly while trying to concentrate, that somehow or another something was going to come in and kind of like harm her in those moments. in conjunction with that, she'd also feel beset by a lot of sort of competing distractive thoughts, sort of thoughts like, oh, I should be doing something else, or I'm not making enough progress, or what I wrote just now wasn't good enough. And so somewhat critical, somewhat distracting, but the fundamental thing being like, you're doing something and you ought to be doing something else instead. And so that would create this sense of dis-ease in a literal sense, that she can't sort of be seated in the center of herself, applying this thing that she's, otherwise very good at. And it almost seemed as if her system was kind of at cross purposes. On the one hand, she wanted to write this book, which seemed very tied to this authentic goal of hers to produce this book. And then her system, as it were, seemed to be throwing up anything and everything to prevent this from happening. Her system was making this very, very hard to do. And as we worked longer in therapy, we kept noticing how there was a divergence between what she'd accomplished in her life and what it had felt like in working towards those accomplishments for her. Outwardly, she'd gotten very high marks in her classes and performed very well at her job, but inwardly, she felt like she couldn't trust herself to get into that state where she could produce at the level she had, supposedly trained others to expect. And we talked about this metaphor of like in the first Indiana Jones movie where he gets the jewel, or I forget what it is, and he's running out of this cavern, and there's all these things he's got to, beat the clock with, and at the end there's like this boulder, on his heels, and he just barely gets out of the shutting door by the skin of his teeth. And that seemed to capture a lot of her experience of going to produce these things each and every time. Her fate felt uncertain, but she was going to try with all her might to, get to this finish line of, say, writing something for work, or, back in the past, studying for an exam or writing an essay for exam. It felt very fraught and, again, uncertain in how she would do it. So, why, as we now kind of think about the case of Carol, and maybe there's something about that can resonate, why might she have had to do this? And I think, this case illustrates how important it can be to figure out some way to shield oneself from the intensity of the emotional injury that a narcissistic parent like Carol's can inflict. So, Carol's childhood was one where her inborn tendency to have her very true and natural positive qualities reflected in her mother's responses was an impossibility. So when she looked to her mother to gain a sense of who she was as a person, she only got back these really, I think, false but insisted upon messages that Carol was worthless, disgusting, and deserving of her mother's and others' contempt. Very cruel and agonizing messages for a child, Carol, to receive. And so at the same time, Carol and children in this boat have to figure out a way to go on being with such a parent. So I think Carol had to find a way to spare herself the worst pain that would happen when she would expect her mother to respond to her in a way that mothers should, such as show pride in something Carol had done or something Carol was interested in. And I think that the way Carol ingeniously actually figured out how to do this was to convince herself that she did not deserve her mother's pride or appreciation. And I think her unconscious set about finding reasons to support this conviction that she was undeserving of what every kid should freely receive from a parent, at least enough of the time. By the way, there's a dog in the background. Her name's Brizo. I don't know if other videos have shown her, but please make Brizo's acquaintance. Okay, and I think that working to find reasons to support this conviction of being undeserving of the good things from her mother is where the breath-holding and distracting thoughts that visit Carol whenever she'd set about to do something that would and should evoke a reaction of pride, whether from herself or in others. You can think of it as sort of a holdover from what she had to learn to employ with her mother, of like, wait, I'm doing things that are making it apparent that I'm deserving of good treatment, and that was very not forthcoming, and something she had to sort of short circuit within herself, that desire, and did so effectively, and to her credit, to survive. But at this point, in this, again, hypothetical treatment, it it became the obstacle itself that she wanted to overcome. But I just want to emphasize that the utility of this strategy, I think, for Carol was that it made her mother's ongoing criticism back then feel less wounding, because it was no longer a surprise or disappointment to Carol that her mother would treat her this way. It was more of like, you know, when her mother would go in on her or accuse her of being selfish, it was sort of like, oh yeah, of course, she's yelling at me for being selfish. I mean, I am. And this way of making life difficult for Carol in this way was sort of an extension of this strategy that was necessary. So I think that the important point about today's video is not to perseverate on the difficulty, faced by the victim of narcissistic abuse, but rather to, point out this strategy so that if you find yourself engaging in it, that it might be noticed and hopefully modified over time and incrementally. So like, for instance, if you notice yourself holding your breath when concentrating, you might work to engage in concentration while staying aware of your breathing. And, that may at the start, it could be like Carol, where it's like, well, if I'm not holding my breath, I don't feel like I can concentrate. But as that is practiced, that often shifts, where concentration and breathing continuously and fully and sort of softly can co-occur. And I think as one's breathing gets regulated, that these competing distractive thoughts of I should be doing something else, or critical assessments of the work you've done so far, also can kind of be challenged helpfully too, because your nervous system becomes less peaked in this process. By peaked, I mean that we have sort of two subsystems in the nervous system. One is called the sympathetic nervous system, and that engages when we need to get very aroused very quickly. Like the fight or flight responses are engendered by the sympathetic nervous system. And I'm going like this because we think of sort of a homeostasis, or like a range of functioning like this, and people also call it kind of like the window of tolerance. And we tend to live life in that range. But when you face this kind of abuse, and especially chronically, the nervous system might get easily up here or down here. And to get down here would be engaging the parasympathetic nervous system, which serves to downregulate ourselves once we've had a spike up to this sort of hyper aroused fight or flight state. So the sympathetic one getting super activated, we're outside the ceiling of that window of tolerance here. And the parasympathetic, when that gets activated, it kind of plummets us down here. I hope those finger gestures were illustrative enough. But in any case, the point is that the more one gets to stay here in that window of tolerance zone in your nervous system by virtue of this breath work and sort of like pairing it with trying to concentrate, the easier it can be to kind of sustain one's efforts towards goals that are important to you. Lastly, and this is something that I plan to address in future videos, but there's also the opportunity to challenge the premise of the belief that life and one's endeavors in it must be hard or difficult in order to do them right. Which curiously I think omitted in what I've described about Carol so far is the notion that Carol can think of herself as she just, without doing something more to prove it, as a very good writer who can apply this talent she possesses with ease. The notion, I think, that one's life and one's endeavors can be easy based on one's talents and aptitudes is one that I think would have to have been forbidden from thinking about for someone like Carol. Because Carol's mom, as we talk about in therapy, would almost seem to look for moments of Carol enjoying her life with the ease that was, she was entitled to and should have been afforded to her. And so it became important for Carol to not experience that ease, which she might otherwise be able to, so that she wasn't vulnerable to such attacks from her mother. In essence, Carol experience her life as being easy seemed to be an act of provocation towards her narcissistically abusive mother. And again, as you gain distance from the narcissistic abuser and that system, these kinds of challenges to these foundational premises of what life has had to feel like, I think can be effectively made, again, over time and with patience and compassion with oneself. Well, thank you everyone for your continued support of the channel. I guess I did want to say I appreciate everyone's comments and definitely read all the comments that are posted. And just as a issue of time, can't respond to them, but find that they are just very, very thoughtful, supportive of one another, and really actually inspiring to see how hard people have been working and thinking about recovering from this form of abuse. And it feels just very valuable to get to witness that kind of community that I think has been formed and continues. So thank you very much for your engagement with this channel. Okay, I hope everyone has a good week, and I will look forward to posting next Sunday at 9 a.m. Pacific time. Take care.